Programming do not necessarily reflect the views of this station, its management, or staff.
Prudent Money with Bob Brooks is sponsored by the Prudent Money Foundation on 91.3.
Well, how to avoid getting ripped off at the auto repair shop. Today we're going to take a look. Stay tuned for the special Car Corner edition of Prudent Money. Good afternoon, this is Bob Brooks, and you are listening to the Prudent Money Radio Show. Thanks so much for joining me today. You know I do appreciate it. Well, on the special Car Corner edition of Prudent Money, it is Tony Joe. He's here every Friday to take your questions. And if you've got a question, well, he's got an answer for you. 877-913-5357 is the number to call, and we'd love to hear from you. If you got a question for me, please go to the website at www.prudentmoney.com. Send it in, and I will get you taken care of. That's all at the website, www.prudentmoney.com. Tony Joe, how are you doing?
Well, you know, I was just sitting here thinking about your business and how you handle things. And, you know, it occurred to me that you really have a good handle on what you do for a living. And even though I'm not a money expert like you are, don't know all the ins and outs like you do. You know, you've studied this your whole life. I mean, that's what you went to school for, and you've been doing it for years and years. I don't understand all of it, but I did get bits and pieces. You know, we talk about things, you and I,
sure.
and you help me to understand some of the terminology and the interest rates and why this affects this and so forth. But, you know, I was thinking even deeper than that. We were talking earlier this year, and you do a lot of football statistics. You keep track of a lot of different players on other teams. You're into the fantasy league, whatever you do. I don't really know how that is. But you made a statement earlier this year, and you said, you know, I see the Cowboys, and of course I disagreed with you, but I see the Cowboys as basically a 500 team this year. And of course I didn't like that statement, but I bit my tongue. And now we're 2 games in. 1 win, 1 loss. You're right on the money, man.
Yeah, right.
You pegged it.
I was wondering
We're
where you're going
exactly
with this.
And I thought, you know, he's good. No wonder he's good at his business. He can see things that others
Well, they
can't.
were undefeated just three weeks ago.
Well, you know,
And that's what you've been predicting.
I always like to play the undefeated card right up until the first loss. But, you know, I start, as people that know me know, I start every Cowboy season with great aspirations. And I usually end them with great disappointment.
And they kick you in the gut.
So,
well, you know, there's not very many generations that remember the good old days.
You know, that's interesting, isn't it?
Think about it. Your kids, your kids weren't alive.
This past 9/11, you know, every year 9/11 rolls around the anniversary. 23 years, I guess, this year. I can't believe how many of my customers, young people, weren't even around at 9/11. You know, I'm like, wow, these kids that come in to pick up their car, you know, and I go, do you know what today? Because I like to preach to the children. I think of them as children. I say, now, you know what today is, right? Tuesday? Close. It's 9/11. Yeah, I heard about that. I said, what year were you born? And they tell me, and I'm like, man, some of these kids were like 1 and 2 during 9/11. I just feel old. I'm like, man, a lot of the people that are walking around today, not a lot, but a good number of them, don't remember 9/11, weren't around at 9/11, don't realize the impact that it had on America at that time.
Oh, it's huge.
And to me, that's a big thing to be missing out of my life because it was such a devastating incident. But anyway, that's another story for another time.
And I think we should go get back to today's topic, as it's getting close to the break, you know. But I know when you got something on your mind, you gotta say it. Just remember, we got a time limit. So let's talk a little bit about getting scammed and getting ripped off. And the with the problem with anything is what we don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And with a car, everybody's got to know something because we all drive them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's complicated, and we don't know, and we've got to trust the advice of someone, which brings me to the important point of, it's so very important to have that relationship with a trusted mechanic, and I don't think people really think about that.
Yeah, it's like anything else. Your mechanic, doctor, attorney, financial advisor. You want to have a good rapport with all the people in your life that you need at certain times. So I need everything but a mechanic,
Yeah, right.
I need a doctor and a lawyer and a dentist, and I need the same things everybody else does. So, yeah, I mean, how you go about that is the question. How, if you don't know anything about a car, how do you know you're getting a fair deal?
Well, let me ask you this question, because that you led me right into the next question that I had for you. It's real easy to say, well, just ask questions. Well, most people don't know the questions to ask. So should you jump to the end and say, what are some things that could happen that are unexpected, and what would that cost? What's the worst case scenario to occur? Or what are the chances are you won't be able to fix my problem? Is that perhaps some of the questions you should be asking? Or, because the reality of it is that we don't know the questions to ask.
Right. That's an interesting question, Bob. And if I could just take a minute, I got a perfect thing that I just thought of in my head. Can I explain that? I mean, this could, I think, make a lot of people understand how things happen. I'm going to tell you right now that a lot of people that work on cars do not rip the customer off intentionally. Now, that's a bold statement to make, but I know and have seen and been around, unfortunately, a lot longer than I want to admit. Most of the mistakes and unnecessary repairs are not really, I'm going to gouge this guy for everything I can get him for. That's really not how it happens. Here's how it happens, okay? It's really not out of intent or malice. It's out of something as simple as this. So let me just establish something that people can think about. I'm thinking right now, when you said that, it brought this to mind. I got a car on the rack, and I'm looking at the backside of the engine, okay? Now, on the backside of most engines is where you will find oil leaks, like a valve cover gasket is at the top of the engine. And you look down below that and you see, say, a variable valve timing solenoid, and below that you see an oil pressure sending unit. And below that, as you keep following down, you'll see where the block and the oil pan come together. And then below that, at the very bottom point where gravity will pull everything to its lowest point and drip off the car, would be, say, the drain plug. So as a mechanic, a lot of people may not understand what I'm talking about, but they'll get the concept in a minute. As I'm looking at everything on the back of the engine that has oil on it, and of course the complaint, by the way, is oil leak. So you look at all these parts and pieces that all have something to do with oil leaks. Every part that I mentioned could leak oil. So you look at all these wet devices back there and all these parts that are wet, and sometimes people will shop will get out a list. Well, the valve cover gasket is leaking, and it looks like the valve timing solenoid is leaking, and it looks like the oil pressure sending unit is leaking. That needs to be replaced. And if you go down, it looks like the oil pan gasket is leaking, and maybe the drain plug gasket is also leaking. So they list all these parts, and they make an estimate out, and they say, this is how much it's going to cost. You got a lot of things wrong with the car. And of course, that's one way to approach it. It's not how you should approach it, but that is one approach that's widely used. What you should do in those cases, and we've talked about this many times about getting a second opinion, what you should do to approach that kind of a problem as a technician is clean off everything. Clean everything off, because the simple truth is the valve cover gasket, as I previously mentioned, is high on the engine. And then gravity is going to make the oil go downhill. It's not going to flow uphill. So you want to find the source of the leak and not just guess at all the parts that have oils that are saturated with oil. What you do to approach this kind of a problem is you clean everything off and you run it. And you find out what's really leaking, because you may be surprised to find that the only thing wrong, this is an example, is that the valve cover is leaking. And it's running downhill, and it's hitting all these other parts and devices on its way downhill because gravity is pulling it down. Then it gets on the valve, the oil pan gasket, makes its way around the gasket before it finally builds up enough oil volume to drip down to, say, the drain plug, and then finally from that, the drain plug is usually the lowest point of the engine because that's where you drain the oil, and then it drips onto the ground. So you've got you've got all these parts and pieces that are wet with oil, but they're not all leaking. So start from the beginning, start in a logical sequence of events, and start with the basics. Let's clean everything off, and then let's find out where it's really coming from. What is the true source of the leak? Now, there's a big difference in price between doing it one way and doing it the other way, or at least there can be, because most of the parts that you saw saturated with oil really don't need to be replaced. They're not the actual source of the leak. And this is why sometimes getting a second opinion is a wise idea, because people will approach jobs in different ways, some better than others. So I'm not saying that the person that wanted to sell you all these parts was trying to rip you off on purpose, but there's another way to approach that kind of a job. And if he was not taught that or doesn't know that, he didn't do it out of intentional trying to rip you off. He just doesn't know any better.
Yeah, I think that, and we always bring this up, that you have people, mechanics, who rely heavily on the red engine light
codes and
that kind of thing. When, as you always say, that's just a starting place that takes you down perhaps the right road to figure out really what's wrong with your car.
It's a good place to start. It gives you some initial data to go on, but that doesn't mean that that's really what's wrong.
Yeah, so it does come down to the experience, the training, and that's of course something people just don't know. One of the things that they suggest to do, and I'm just curious as to how many people actually ask this when your customers, when they come in, is to get a written estimate, get it in writing.
Right. That of course is always a good idea, and I'm trying desperately to think of how I would protect myself if I didn't know anything about a car, and I guess it just keeps resorting back to, if it's a big amount of money, get another opinion, because different shops may diagnose things in a different way. And when you find out one shop wanted $1,300 and the other shop can fix it for $130, I mean, it's worth a second opinion.
Well, let me ask you this. How do you decipher whether going for the $150 is going to get it fixed versus you really needed the $1,300?
Proof's in the pudding. You spend $130. If that didn't fix it, you don't go back there. But
no easy answer. Yeah,
look at what you're risking versus what the reward might be. What if $130 was the original source of the leak and it fixed everything? You're going to be pretty happy then.
Sure.
Or you should be.
Sure.
You just got away with 90% of the bill that was unnecessary. So you can't always, there's no really concrete way to protect yourself in all aspects of car repair. Of course, what you asked me just then was, how do you know the 130 isn't going to... Well, if it doesn't stop the leak, then you have recourse to go back to the shop and say, hey, that didn't stop the leak. And you handle it. Try to be nice and try to work with the shop owner. And in most cases, he's going to be willing to... He doesn't want that either, so he'll be willing to deal somehow with resolving this issue. But the worst case scenario is you spent $130 and it didn't fix the leak, but you didn't spend $1,300 and it didn't fix the leak.
Right.
So
So talk a little bit about the situation where you bring your car in and it's got a noise, and so you drive the car off the lot, the noise is gone, and then it comes. I mean, you're halfway down the street and the noise comes back, and there's more work obviously to be done. Didn't fix the right problem. Who pays for this point going forward?
all right, let me start from and the aspect of how you conduct business in the first place. You're asking about a car that came in with a noise and it was diagnosed and then repaired, and then the
Right.
person picked it up. Then the noise came back half a block away or half a mile away.
Sure.
Okay. This is a very interesting scenario that you want to be aware of is sometimes people will complain about the time it takes to get their car fixed. And I understand that. Everybody needs their car. You drive the vehicle and you test it, and sometimes you test it twice. You keep that car as long as you need to make sure that noise is not coming back. That's the best a person like me and his independent shop owner can do is thoroughly test it after you repaired it. Make sure there's no more problem. Even if you do it 2 times, just to be sure, that's about as far as you can expect a person to go. Now, if it comes back after that, then obviously something was missed. Something was, there's more work's going to need to be done. And in that case, you would talk to the customer and kind of work out a plan between the two of you to say, look, I fixed what I thought was wrong. It didn't fix the problem. So let me address, now that I know the problem, let me address that with you. And let's see if we can work something out, because the part that I replaced, obviously, Bob, you don't replace parts that don't need to be done.
Sure.
But if you replaced a part that legitimately was making a noise and you and then the person picked it up and then it makes noise 2 days later or half a mile later, something got missed. It wasn't done intentionally, but an accident, it was missed, as in maybe there was another part that had a bad bearing or something, and you didn't know it. When usually those things will resolve themselves right there in the shop, because if you change a part that you thought was making the noise and you put everything back together and you go to test drive it, if that person was going to get a half a block away and hear the noise, you're going to hear it half a block away. That's why you test. You always test thoroughly when you're done, so that it doesn't embarrass you. That is the most embarrassing thing when that happens. So most shops don't want that, so they do a pretty good job of test driving the vehicle and making sure that everything seems okay.
So let's talk a little bit about the process of upselling, selling you maybe parts and services you don't need.
Okay.
Give a good example of that, and let's we're just picking on the Jiffy Lube, not Jiffy Lube, but the fast lube places
Right.
that you can drive in and get your oil changed. What are some of the practices that happen through that process?
Well, in my opinion, which is all I can speak to, is a lot of the cases where they're selling products or services, as in brake fluid replacement, coolant replacement, power steering flush, some of these are not necessarily indicative of ongoing problems, but they will use certain kinds of test equipment, sometimes litmus paper, things like that, where they will test for water contamination. Now, for years, we did litmus tests during the process of Texas state inspection years ago. And, Bob, there is a certain degree of judgment there, okay?
Right.
You can look at it and see that it's blue, or you can look at it and see that it's hardly blue at all. I mean, a little bit maybe if you put it under a microscope. So there's a judgment call there on whether you really need those services. And I've seen an awful lot of proof, enough to convince me, with customers who have come to me with, they told me I needed a brake fluid flush. And I look at it and go, well, it really doesn't need to be done. But they told me it needed to be done, and I just had it done with that place last year. Okay, well, you know what? That's a little bit of overkill. You don't need these flushes every single year. So somebody may have been trying to, what we call, upsell them on the basis that maybe they work on commission, and they have a family to feed too, and maybe they were pushing the envelope a little bit. But without saying they're just ripping you off, I will say that it's a judgment call in a lot of cases. And if that judgment call goes one way, they're going to tell you need it. And if the judgment call goes another way, then you don't need it. So how do you protect yourself from that? Well, a lot of the services that you get for flushing different fluids in the vehicle, you want to keep records. Because if you had your brake fluid flushed a year ago and they're trying to tell you that it needs to be done again, and you've had no brake issues and nothing's changed, then that's overkill. You don't need to have it done every single year. So by keeping records, you can say, well, gosh, I just had it done. You can always call. You can look it up online. You can look at several different resources to find out, does it seem likely I would need to have it done again? And you can always just call people. You can call shops and ask them. So, there's a great degree. Here we go again, Bob. There's a great degree of judgment there. What would you think, and what do you think? Well, there's a tinge of blue in there, and as opposed to the whole paper just turned blue.
Right.
So yeah, I don't know. It's hard to explain. It's hard to protect yourself in those situations. But again, if you get some of these maintenance fluid flushes, you can always resort back to your records. That's why I tell you, keep the records for the oil changes and what else they did to it. Because you can always ask a mechanic, hey, look at this. I had my oil change last year and I had my brake fluid flushed and all that. Now they want to do it again. Okay, that's just an example. This doesn't mean anything definite. So I'm just giving you an example of keep good records and talk to somebody if you're not sure.
This question, however you answer this question, is not a for or against getting maintenance, written down maintenance processes done to your car. But the dealership, you buy a new car from the dealership and they've got it laid out. This is when you bring it in for this, this, and this. Do you think that that's a little bit? Have you seen situations where you think, boy, that's overkill? They really don't need to get so many of these different services done.
Let me just explain that. That's a really good question, because there is a school of thought out there that these maintenance items is too much. It's too much. You don't need all this. Well, you know what? There's nothing wrong with testing as much as you can. Now, let me tell you where the screw in the wrench comes in, so to speak. A lot of those columns, when you read them, they will say I in parentheses for inspect only, not replace, inspect. The ones that definitely need to be done due to a mileage interval and the parts are more than likely worn out will have an R by them. So replace or inspect. Now there could be 100 items on that list. 98 of them are I only, inspect. So you got to look carefully at the schedule and really determine what it's trying to tell you.
This is Bob Brooks. If you got a question for me, please go to the website at prudentmoney.com and send it in, because we are all out of time. Till we do meet again next time, keep the faith and have a great rest of the day.
That's all the time we have for today. Questions or comments for Bob, or to find out more great information like what you've just heard, visit www.prudentmoney.com. Be sure to join Bob Brooks again for the next edition of Prudent Money.